Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Invisibles, the untold story of African American slaves in the White House, by Jesse Holland. Narrated by J.D. Jackson. Forward. I decided I would write a second book in 2008 while riding on then-Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign bus as he made a weekend stopover at his home in Chicago, Illinois. My first book, Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African American History in and Around Washington, D.C., had been moderately successful. But after taking more than a year off, I went back to work at the Associated Press as a political reporter. However, I quickly realized that I still had the desire to write books. The problem was deciding what to write. I wrote my first book on unsung African American history in the nation's capital, in part because I walked into a library one day looking for a book that would describe the black history of the National Mall and couldn't find one. I knew from years of conversations with native Washingtonians, historians, and experts on black history that there were quite a few stories about African Americans that could be told about the Capitol, the White House, and other places in and around the center of Washington. However, no one had bothered to collect and verify these accounts. Since I wanted to read these tales, I decided that I would take it upon myself to write them for anyone else who would be interested. But what would be next? Was there another area of African American history that deserved exploration in Washington, D.C., that hadn't been touched by other authors? Something that I could sink my teeth into without having to rush to publication. I thought about trying to write a book about Obama's candidacy, but knew hundreds of other authors were considering and possibly even working on the same idea, something that would intensify if Obama won. It would have to be something that would justify the many hours away from my family researching and writing, and national enough in scope to draw the attention of publishers looking for a new project. Most of all, it would have to be something that interested me personally, something historically significant that I myself would purchase if I was walking through a bookstore with disposable cash and a yearning to know more about history. Then it hit me. All through Obama's campaign, people talked about the historical significance of an African American politician having the chance to live inside the White House. But I knew that Obama couldn't have been the first black person to live inside the White House. There had to be some history there. Even better, there had to be a book. I was so excited I immediately called the editor of my first book on African American history, Maureen Graney, and started babbling ideas over the phone to her about writing an African American history of the White House. Maureen wisely tempered my enthusiasm by telling me to sit down and think about what I really wanted to say. Eventually, I came up with 3 different ideas about 3 different eras of African American history in the White House that I wanted to explore. The slaves who lived at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with the president, the servants who worked inside the executive mansion for the president, and the African American men and women who wanted to be president. This is the beginning of the beginning. A look at the slaves who worked to build the White House, the slaves who lived inside the presidential mansions in New York City and Philadelphia at the dawn of the United States, and the first slaves to live inside the White House. I want to be clear that this is only a first look, because we are still discovering who these slaves were, what they were like, and what happened to them after they left the clutches of the president who held them in bondage. Every year, someone finds out something new about these African American men and women. But that should be expected, because until recently, no one has really cared about who these men and women were. Unlike the presidents they served, whose every statement and movement was recorded and studied, very little was left behind to tell us about the lives of the slaves whose work allowed these men to reach for greatness through the wealth that human slavery brought them. Only by reading between the lines and scouring letters, diaries, and documents left behind by their white masters can we begin to piece together the lives of the enslaved African Americans who took care of the president and his family while the president took care of the United States. They deserve the attempt. Chapter 1. Introduction. A slave from Virginia escaped his bondage and crossed over the Potomac to Washington, D.C., hoping to find a friendly soul who would help him in his bid for freedom from bondage. Stealthily wandering through the nation's capital, avoiding ruthless slave catchers, pitiless merchants, and plantation owners, he came upon a large white mansion in the middle of the city. Hoping the owner's heart would be as large as his home, the slave knocked on the front door, seeking shelter and perhaps a few scraps of food to eat before heading upriver toward Baltimore and freedom. A man answered the door, but not the owner. A lackey who spent too much time asking obvious questions, clearly stalling for time. A few seconds later, the slave heard an upstairs window being opened, and a male voice demanding to know what the disheveled man wanted. "I am a fugitive from one who calls himself my master," the slave said. "I am weary and hungry, and having swam the river, I wish to rest here a while and dry my garments, and get a little to eat. For it is a long way to Canada, and I must rest where I can, and depend on charity for food, for I have no money. And I expect that my master will soon be in pursuit of me." And then the man in the window leaned out and looked down, with a sneer on his face. "This is the last place in the world for a fugitive slave to find refuge. This is the President's house, and I am the President of the United States, and a Democratic president, too, and my chief business is to catch just such fellows as you." The slave couldn't believe his ears. "That cannot be, for I see on yonder capitol the flag of liberty, glittering with stars, and the eagle, with widespread wings, holds in his talons the arrows fatal to tyrants. Surely every man within the shadow of the Capitol must be worthy of carrying such a banner." The president chortled. "How simple you are. That flag only signifies that this land is the home of the oppressed of all nations except its own. We use it when we march against fugitive slaves." Leaning from the window, the president rubbed his hands together. "You need not come here for refuge. I am the man who executes the fugitive law of which I know you have heard, and I do it with alacrity. It is natural to me. I like it. I have something of the bloodhound in my own composition, and something of the turkey buzzard. Do not come to me for displays of humanity. I am not a man but a president, a democratic president. So, away with you, for I will myself take you back to your master." The slave turned to run, but looked back up at the man in the White House one last time. "If I had known that this was the house of the president, I would not have asked for charity here. But I thought this was the house of a man." So turning on his heel, he fled hastily away, and the president shut the window, and the lackey the door, each in great disgust. Reported the Anti-Slavery Bugle out of Lisbon, Ohio, in its September 27, 1856 edition. A stirring tale, one likely meant to tug at heartstrings and to express disgust at the hypocrisy of a government system that threw off the shackles of bondage from faraway masters to create a free country, but yet condoned and encouraged a system of human chattel throughout its borders. It is also likely completely false. An apocryphal story meant only as propaganda to rile up abolitionists and their allies against the pro-slavery forces in the South, who were already discussing possible treason by breaking away from the United States to form a confederacy of states where slavery would remain the cornerstone of the agrarian economy. However, Even in fiction, there are some painful truths. With only two notable exceptions, no president in the early history of the United States would have offered succor to a fugitive slave looking for freedom. This is because they were a slave owner themselves, with their Negro maids, butlers, cooks, coachmen, and servants confined to an existence of servitude behind the very walls of the White House itself, or toiling in the fields and barns of the president's home plantations, miles away from the Capitol. Outside of John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams, the first father and son presidents, Quakers, and the only early presidents to fervently oppose slavery and back up their words by refusing to keep their fellow men in bondage, none of the early presidents would have been sympathetic to the plight of an escaped slave, simply because they wouldn't have wanted any of their own human property to get the idea that escaping from a life of servitude was possible. But this book is not about those presidents, as interesting as they are. The lives of the founding fathers and the early presidents, their failures, their triumphs, their families, their politics, and their legacies, have been investigated and told and retold ad nauseum by their descendants and interested academics, politicians, students, enthusiasts, and admirers. This book is about the enslaved people behind those presidents, the ones who made their beds, cooked their food, prepared their clothes, answered the door, and in general made life at the White House work while the presidents and their families took care of the business of America. This book is about those enslaved African Americans who were first-hand witnesses to history, but victims of it as well. These are the accounts of the enslaved cooks, butlers, maids, doormen, body servants, and carriage drivers whose lives were unwillingly dedicated to making the life of the president somewhat easier in the midst of the rough-and-tumble politics of the nation's capital. And like the chief executive, these slaves are among the few who had the exclusive right to call the presidential mansion at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue their home. When President Barack Obama and his family first entered the White House following his sweeping 2008 presidential election win, they weren't the first African-American family to live inside the executive mansion. That honor, if it can be considered that, was achieved a couple of centuries ago by men and women, most of whose names we don't know, who were not celebrities, and much of whose lives have been lost to history. It is likely that Obama himself doesn't know their names, despite walking the same halls that they did and sleeping a mere floor away from where they rested their heads. It is the lives of these men and women, the forgotten dozens of African-American men and women who were held in slavery inside the White House by the executive mansion's occupants, the presidents of the United States, that we explore in this work in an attempt to recover their identities and provide some much-needed recognition to their contributions, not only to the life and comforts of the presidents they served, but to America as a whole. The election of Obama brought new attention to the African-American history of the White House, and especially the use of slavery in its construction. The first black president of the United States living in a mansion constructed with the labor of unpaid African-American slaves inspired eager reporters and historians to delve into the African-American history of the building. The slaves who helped designer James Hoban construct the original building, which was burned by the British in the War of 1812. The domestic servants such as seamstress Elizabeth Keckley, a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, and White House butlers Alonzo Fields and Eugene Allen, whose life story was fictionalized by Hollywood for the movie The Butler, who walked with presidents and founded the upper-middle-class black structure of the District of Columbia, and political figures such as E. Frederick Morrill, the first African-American to be officially appointed a White House aide, and Andrew T. Hatcher, the first African-American to be named Associate White House Press Secretary. But lost in this historical exploration are the names of William Lee, Oney Judge, John Freeman, and Paul Jennings, men and women who actually lived inside the White House, and other executive mansions as slaves of the presidents, slaves who toiled silently behind the scenes to care for the daily needs of the president, freeing the nation's chief executive and his family from the drudgery of domestic work to concentrate on the cares of the nation in its earliest days. They lived and they loved outside of their enslavement to the president, but few of their tales have been told. It always surprises me that the people I've told over the years about this project are startled to realize that slavery was actively practiced inside the White House. Known interchangeably as the White House, the Executive Mansion, the President's House, or the Presidential Mansion, the whitewashed building and all that it entails symbolizes the power and prestige of the United States of America, the truth and honor of the American form of government, as well as the freedom and dignity of all the people who make up this great country. This is probably why few people associate the so-called President's House, this shining symbol of our American democracy, with one of the greatest scourges of humankind's existence, slavery. Starting with the nation's first president, General George Washington, and proceeding through the architect of the North's victory in the Civil War, General Ulysses S. Grant, 12 of the first 18 U.S. presidents owned Africans as slaves at one time or another in their lives. Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Andrew Johnson, and Grant all had different attitudes about slavery during their time as president, but all kept African American slaves. Grant is revered as the general who led the United States to victory over the rebellious and treasonous Confederate States of America, which wanted to secede in part over its desire to continue legal human slavery within its borders. However, Grant at one point was a slaveholder himself. Given a slave by his father-in-law in Missouri, Grant freed him before the beginning of the Civil War, writing in a court document in 1859 that he does hereby manumit, emancipate, and set free from slavery my Negro man William, sometimes called William Jones, forever. Grant in his later life would remember, "We felt that it was a stain to the Union that men should be bought and sold like cattle." Other American presidents felt the same way, but it did not stop them from using African slaves to enrich their lives both inside and outside the White House. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison all spoke against slavery before becoming president, yet kept slaves at their plantations to help line their pockets and keep them in the American aristocracy. Madison repeatedly said that slavery was wrong, and even spoke against it during the creation of the Constitution. "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time, a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man," Madison said during a speech at the Constitutional Convention on June 6, 1787. Yet during that same period, Madison owned more than 100 slaves at his Montpelier estate, and refused to release them upon his death, as his other wealthy and powerful compatriots did. The only concession he made was to ask his wife Dolly not to sell any slaves without their consent contingent upon their good behavior after his death, advice Mrs. Madison didn't even follow. These same men, once elected president, did not want to incur the expense of paying for a staff to take care of the basic housekeeping functions of the presidential domicile. Congress, during the administration of these first 12 presidents, did not provide funding for a domestic staff for the White House, leaving it to the presidents to figure out how to pay for cooks, butlers, washerwomen, and the other household staff needed for a mansion the size of the White House. So, to defray the cost of household help, 8 of those 12 slaveholding presidents brought their slaves along to work with them inside the presidential mansions in which they resided. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Tyler, Polk, and Taylor. These African slaves began the tradition of African American service to the President of the United States. The non-slaveholding presidents, like John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams, complained bitterly about the cost they incurred paying for the domestic staff for the White House and other presidential homes. Abigail Adams estimated that she needed at least 30 workers to make the Great Castle in Washington run properly, but since her family was not rich, she made do with 6. The Southern slave owners who ascended to the presidency had no such problems. They simply imported slaves from plantations such as Mount Vernon, Montpelier, Monticello, Sherwood Forest, and the Hermitage, and installed them as the domestic staff inside the presidential residence. When a new president moved in, he would bring his slaves with him and his family to Washington, set them up inside the White House, and give them the training they needed to deal with the day-to-day life necessities of the president's family and the entertainment and social functions of the most powerful man in America. Few people today know of these slaves' existence, much less their names, but their tales tell us of who we were as a country, who we are now as Americans, and who we might become in the future. Before we determine our future, we must explore the past and find out who these slaves were. That information is not easily accessible, even for people who have access to the White House. That would seem to be an obvious place to begin since, after all, it's the home of the president and where the majority of these slaves lived. It's one of the best-known structures in the United States, toured by thousands upon thousands of people each year. But even for those who know the White House slaves existed, finding any trace of their existence in today's White House is almost impossible. We expect today some indication in a Southern mansion that slaves were once used to maintain the property. Many Southern plantations and mansions now preserve or recreate the outhouses and slave quarters for heritage tourists who want to know how slaves lived and worked in the antebellum era. Mount Vernon, the nearby home plantation of President George Washington, touts its slave quarters as part of the tour for those who wish to see how the slaves owned by the first president lived. And at Monticello, home of Thomas Jefferson, drafter of the Declaration of Independence and the third president, docents offer a tour specifically aimed at those wondering about the lives of the president's slaves, focusing on the experiences of the enslaved people who lived and labored on the Monticello plantation. But there is nothing inside the executive mansion to mark the existence of the slaves who lived and worked there, despite the fact that hundreds of people walk through the former slave quarters at the White House on a daily basis and never know it. Each December, the highlight of the Washington social scene is the invitation-only annual White House Christmas party. The executive mansion is exquisitely decorated from top to bottom, and hundreds of dignitaries, celebrities, government officials, and media types gather to see and be seen at the epicenter of political power in the United States. But each year, one person is missing from the party: the President of the United States. Instead of mingling with the guests, the President and the First Lady head a formal receiving line for the guests who have abandoned the party to go downstairs for the privilege of shaking hands with them. For Obama, this ritual receiving line has been staged in the formal Oval Diplomatic Reception Room, which for the prerequisite photos of the presidential handshake is set up like a photo studio with big lights and white silk screens. Normally, the room serves a very different function. The Diplomatic Reception Room is an entrance to the White House from the National Mall for the family and a location for important news conferences for the president. For such an important room, its true history is often missed. The millions of people who see that room on television and the thousands who walk through it on tours and at the White House Christmas party don't know they're looking at part of what originally was the slave quarters inside the White House. The African American slaves most often had rooms in the White House's basement, referred to as the ground floor today because it opens out onto the South Gardens and the National Mall. These were airy rooms directly beneath the principal floor of the house and on the north and south sides of the long, groin-vaulted hall that ran from one end of the house to the other, according to William Seals, the President's house. These rooms are now used as a library, china room, offices, and the formal oval diplomatic reception room. However, this vaulted corridor once accessed a great kitchen 40 feet long, with large fireplaces at each end, a family kitchen, an oval servants' hall, the steward's quarters, storage and workrooms, and the servant and slave bedrooms. This is where the presidents stashed their slaves, where enslaved Africans ate, slept, socialized, and made the best of their imprisonment, all while making the lives of the president and his family as easy as possible so that the affairs of the household could be ignored for the more important affairs of state. It was likely here where slave women like Fanny Herne and Edie Fawcett gave birth to and lost some of the first babies born inside the White House, where enslaved men and women cried for the loss of relatives sold to the South by uncaring masters for seeking their freedom in the North, where bone-tired women and men wearily shed their brightly colored maid and butler costumes, rubbed aching feet and shoulders, and fantasized of a day where the whims of another family did not rule their lives. Little did these souls dream that one day, hundreds of years later, an African-American family who looked like them would reside on the top floor of the White House, not in its basement, a family who would be served by White House domestics instead of being the one serving, a first family who could proudly claim slaves like them in their heritage and perhaps close the circle of history for the most recognizable home in America. But that history, the story of slavery, the presidency, and the White House, doesn't start in Washington. It starts in New York City, the first capital of the United States, and with the first president, General George Washington. While the White House is in Washington, the first presidential residence was actually in Manhattan, where General Washington took the oath of office and served the first term of his presidency. It is also where the first slaves began their service to the American president. Chapter 2. William Lee and New York City. New York City of 1789 was a bustling, babbling city, jammed to overflowing with Americans from all walks of life. Silk-stocking, wig-wearing gentlefolk, destitute and broken-down beggars, and leather-apron-wearing working men and washerwomen of all colors, creeds, and religions, building what would soon be the nation's busiest seaport and largest city. For William Lee, looking at the buildings of the growing city and the constant movement and languages of Manhattan must have quickened his heart, for it was a long way from his home at Mount Vernon, Virginia. But unlike many new visitors to New York, Lee knew that he had the most prestigious address in town as his new home, the executive mansion of the new president, George Washington. Unlike many new citizens of the United States, Lee personally knew the former general and hero of the recently ended War of Independence against Great Britain. He had ridden into battle with Washington against the once fearsome Redcoat Army of England, side by side with the Virginia-born general, in both bad times at Valley Forge and good at Yorktown, where the great British general Lord Cornwallis surrendered his sword by proxy in shame for having lost to an army of colonists. Lee had been summoned to live in the presidential mansion by Washington. Of course, other Americans had a choice that Lee did not, whether to accept or refuse. Lee did not have that option, because he was not Washington's friend, nor his comrade in arms, nor his employee. William Lee was Washington's slave, and when his master called...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?